Welcome to the inquiry on the BBC World Service. One pressing question, four expert witnesses, challenging answers. It's a summer's day in August 1997, and Captain Charles Moore is in one of his favourite places, the middle of nowhere. He's sailing through a little travelled part of the Pacific Ocean. Charles Moore grew up surfing and sailing. He loves the ocean, one of the Earth's last great unspoiled environments. So this day should be perfect. But when he steps on deck, instead of pristine water, he sees something else. Plastic. Just tiny traces, but everywhere he looks, he sees the debris of human civilization. What Charles Moore stumbled across 20 years ago has become known as the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. This huge collection of rubbish has become a symbol of our problem with plastic waste, and it's getting worse. One study estimates that by 2050, the world's oceans will contain more plastic than fish. This week, we're going to look at the issue of plastic waste by focusing on one product that we all use, the plastic bottle. In the minute or so I've been talking, around 1 million of them have been sold around the world. I'm James Fletcher, and in this inquiry we're asking, is it time to ban the plastic bottle?
Part 1. The Great Pacific Garbage Patch.
I'm outside. We have outside steering station here on the vessel. It's a 50-foot catamaran.
Our first expert witness is the ocean-loving explorer we just heard about, Captain Charles Moore, speaking to us from the deck of the Algeta.
I'm seeing my ladder for the divers, nets to pick up marine debris, and I'm seeing the bell that we use to call people to dinner.
Charles Moore is going to help us understand the scale of our waste problem. It was from this very same deck 20 years ago that he first saw the plastic floating by in the middle of the Pacific.
This was chips, just like breadcrumbs. My thought was, well, it's not like Hansel and Gretel have been here and sent me a track of breadcrumbs to follow home. This must be a larger phenomenon. It was more of a question than raising an alarm bell.
When he got home, this question kept playing on his mind, and 2 years later, he decided to follow the trail of the plastic crumbs. He returned to the area to do more research.
In that first trawl in 1999, it came up with so much plastic in it that I was shocked. When we're thinking that as far as you can get from human civilization, the ratio of trash to actual food is so high, that really sends alarm bells.
Captain Moore's nets pulled up 6 times as much plastic as plankton. This discovery led him to dedicate his life to researching plastic pollution in the oceans, returning many times to the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. And each time he goes back, it gets worse.
My dear friend, I hate to tell you this, but as a scientist I must. It's 60 times what it was in 1999.
Do you now see it when you go out there on the surface of the water? Is it much more noticeable?
Oh my goodness, it's a garbage dump. Sometimes I can't tell whether I'm at home in the harbor after a rain or out in the middle of the Pacific.
This garbage dump stretches across the ocean between California and Hawaii. Waste comes from countries all around the Pacific and is carried by ocean currents. Drop a plastic bottle in the ocean in China or Indonesia, and it might end up in the Great Pacific Garbage Patch.
The coasts of the ocean act like sides of the bathtub, and the currents bounce off the coasts. And these high-pressure systems tend to have eddies that swirl into the center.
The patch between Hawaii and California isn't the only one.
Oh my goodness, there's the Western Garbage Patch off Japan, the South Pacific Garbage Patch, which is equally horrendous, and then there's the South Atlantic. The North Atlantic, then you've got the Indian Ocean as well. 40% approximately of the world ocean is these accumulating areas.
It's a vast amount of garbage, an estimated 5 trillion pieces, and that's just the floating plastic. But the oceans are vast places too. Is the garbage a problem?
The evidence is accumulating daily. Millions of marine animals every year. We have entanglement, things dying all the time, caught in this stuff. They can't move, can't feed. They die excruciating deaths.
Plastic eventually breaks down in the ocean, and marine animals mistake the small coloured chips and flakes for food.
We're poisoning them, and that's coming back to us. The average consumer in Europe could be consuming 11,000 pieces of plastic per year with their shellfish.
Shellfish filter seawater for food and end up with microscopic fragments of plastic lodged in their bodies, which we then eat. It's not yet known exactly what impact this plastic has, but there are concerns that chemicals in plastic could affect hormonal balance and fertility. There's a vast variety of different types of plastic in the ocean, but there's one product that stands out.
I just came back, many hundreds of miles out to sea, and the one thing that we can reliably pull up on almost daily basis is a bottle. They're the most common item that we find floating out in the middle of the ocean.
Plastic bottles, the type we use for soft drinks and water, are a double threat. With the lid on, they float, ending up in the surface garbage patches. With the lid off, they sink.
There are bottle garbage patches on the bottom of the ocean. They're going to be getting larger and larger, and that's something that will be explored by scientists of the future.
So how did plastic bottles become such a thing? Time for our next expert witness.
Part 2. Selling ice to Inuits.
It's a stunning reality. I work in a big city in California. I know where the nearest store selling bottled water is, but I can no longer tell you where the nearest public water fountain is.
Our second expert witness is Peter Glick, author of Bottled and Sold, the story behind our obsession with bottled water.
We go to the supermarket and there's shelves taking up enormous amounts of space with different brands of basically the same thing, packaged water, for an incredibly high cost. Bottled water, because we sell literally hundreds of billions of these plastic bottles a year, contribute to much of the waste in our waste streams. The plastic waste problem is massive.
So if bottled water is such a big part of our plastic bottle problem, how did we end up buying so much of the stuff?
Going back 100 years, there have been for a long time mineral waters, specialty waters. They were sold sort of as particular health items. Sometimes people would go to spas 100 years ago for the waters. But the idea of commercial bottled water for the masses really didn't take a hold until, I would say, the 1970s.
And like many fashions, it was the French leading the way.
Deep below the plains of southern France, in a mysterious process begun millions of years ago, nature herself.
I guess in the 1970s, there was an advertisement using the incredibly wonderful voice of Orson Welles to sell Perrier as an example of something that was special, that it had cachet, that it was healthy water from the center of the earth.
Perrier.
Perrier may have had cachet, but it was clunky, sold in relatively large glass bottles that were heavy and breakable. Then, in the mid-1970s, a revolutionary new bottle arrived.
The plastic that we use for bottled water is called PET, polyethylene terephthalate. It's actually a superb plastic for packaging food. It doesn't impart a taste. It doesn't leach bad chemicals to the extent that we know. It's cheap, it's easily transported, and it's perfect for bottling water.
But in the developed world, bottled water companies faced a problem.
We had, and still today have, a remarkably fantastic municipal water system that provides incredibly high-quality, low-cost water to every household that has a pipe, which is almost all of our households. So how do you compete against that? Well, you compete against that by advertising, by convincing people that your brand of bottled water is going to make you more popular or sexier or healthier.
Hi, I'm Jen Aniston, and I'm here to talk to you about Smart Water.
So Jennifer Aniston is a very well-known actress, of course, but she's also a well-known seller of bottled water. And if you take a look at just some of the advertisements that have been produced for her brands of bottled water, they basically involve plays on sex, on her appearance.
But if Rachel from Friends isn't alluring enough,
I'm gobsmacked regularly by stories in the bottled water world, by the idea that somebody is going to go to an iceberg and chip off pieces of icebergs and melt the water and bottle it and claim that it's something special. But there's nothing special about bottled water. It's H2O.
and if adding exotic locations still doesn't work, how about fear?
I've gotten advertisements in the mail from bottled water companies saying, quote, "You don't know what's in your tap water." Of course, there's nothing wrong with my tap water, but that advertisement was trying to get me to buy a subscription to home deliveries of bottled water. And that's just one of many examples we've seen from the industry.
Of course, there are plenty of people around the world who don't have access to good quality tap water.
The solution to bad water in the developing world is not bottled water. The solution is to figure out a way to bring high-quality, inexpensive tap water to everybody. We can't afford bottled water.
Our second expert witness has explained how the bottled water industry came out of nowhere in the last 40 years. Aided by the invention of the PET plastic bottle, they used advertising to convince us to buy something that many of us could already get for free. And it's been astonishingly successful.
Today, worldwide, we're probably selling 400 billion liters of bottled water a year.
That's a mind-boggling number.
It's a mind-boggling number, indeed.
It's not just the US and Europe. China, Indonesia, India and Thailand are among the world's biggest and fastest growing consumers of bottled water. But if people survived without bottled water until 40 years ago, could we do so again? Could we ban the bottle?
Part 3. The San Fran Ban Plan.
You ready to go at your end?
I can't. Sorry, we were. They were offering me water, but the irony is they were about to offer me plastic water, bottled water, and there's just too much about that was not karmic.
Proving that no matter how hard you try, sometimes you just can't escape the plastic water bottle is our third expert witness, David Chu.
The reason it might be next to me in the studio is that we're in Sacramento, where in San Francisco a number of years ago, I passed a local law that phases out plastic water bottles in the city of San Francisco.
David Chu is now a member of California's State Assembly in Sacramento. Back in 2013, as a local politician in San Francisco, he was getting worried about waste.
It's estimated that every week you could circle the globe twice with the number of single-use plastic water bottles that are discarded by Americans alone. As someone who is a novice surfer, seeing them on our beaches, and when I learned that universities had phased them out, that parks had phased them out, I thought, why not my city of San Francisco?
And so what did you do?
So we proposed a few years ago that we phase out single-use plastic water bottles on public properties and public spaces in San Francisco. So what this means is not just public buildings, but public parks, major large-scale events, that we not allow their sale on those properties and really discourage their use.
San Francisco became one of the first major cities anywhere to ban the water bottle. The ban only affects city-owned property and public spaces, so you can still buy bottled water in most corner stores or supermarkets.
As you can imagine, a blanket ban would have been a lot harder to implement as quickly as we did. As it was, it took us several months to negotiate the language for a ban on public properties and in public spaces, and we wanted to use this time to educate consumers on their alternatives.
That means using refillable containers, and the city invested in drink fountains and water filling stations to make water easily accessible. At concerts and outdoor events, there are giant tanks of water. But as we heard in part 2, plain old H2O just can't compete against melted icebergs and Jennifer Aniston. So San Francisco took on bottled water with a bit of branding of its own.
It was part of our campaign. Our water runs from the mountains in Northern California, and we thought we should be proud and let our public know that the water they drink out of the tap comes from a great place, comes from a source known as Hetch Hetchy. So we refer to Hetch Hetchy water.
So Hetch Hetchy sounds a bit cooler than tap water.
That is probably true.
But not everyone was sold on the idea of Hetch Hetchy.
It was certainly suggested when I introduced this idea that even banning plastic water bottles on public spaces would be catastrophic, and that has not turned out to be.
And what evidence is there about the impact the ban has had?
Every time we have a major large-scale event, a music concert, we were hosting the America's Cup a few years ago, we don't have to pick up hundreds of thousands of discarded single-use plastic water bottles, and that's a real impact.
David Chu says the ban has been a success, but at this stage, the city hasn't released any hard data on its impact on bottled water sales or waste. Another question is whether people might be replacing bottled water with other bottled drinks, soft drinks or fruit juice, which are equally wasteful.
I have not heard that there's been a switch in consumption, but it certainly would be something that we monitor.
And banning those other bottles would be much harder because, unlike water, there's no easy alternative.
That's true. But again, this is why we are continuing to campaign to let San Franciscans know how good we have it when it comes to the water out of our tap.
So, is it time to ban the plastic bottle? We've already heard about the rapidly growing plastic pollution in our oceans and how bottled water is a big part of the problem, when for many there's an easy alternative. And now our third expert witness has explained how San Francisco has taken a step towards a ban. It's just one city and just one source of plastic bottles. But David Chu says an earlier ban on plastic bags shows you've got to start somewhere.
Phasing out plastic bags was something that started in San Francisco and a few cities. It then exploded to several hundred cities, which then was able to be the impetus for the passage of a state law. This is the existential question of the day. How do we protect our globe? How do we protect our environment? And I do think that phasing out plastic water bottles should be part of the solution.
So what does the rest of the solution look like? Time for our final expert witness.
Part 4. Respect the plastic god.
When I travel to countries without solid waste services to the degree that I would like to see, then I take all my plastic waste, no matter how small, I take it back home and I dispose of it at a plastic container back home in the Netherlands.
This global traveller with a suitcase of unusual souvenirs is Liliana Rodic-Wiersma.
So you, on your return trip, what proportion of your luggage would you say is plastic waste?
That's a very confronting experience indeed when I look at how much volume plastic waste takes in my suitcase on my way back.
Liliana Rodic-Wiersma is an environmental scientist who looks at the big picture of waste management issues. So, to lighten her luggage and our impact on the planet, should we ban the plastic bottle?
Banning plastic bottles could be a part of the solution, but it cannot be a solution on its own. It has to be accompanied by availability of suitable alternatives in terms of functions that plastic bottles currently fulfill.
As we've heard, it's one thing to ban water bottles in places where there are other ways to get water. But she says trying to ban juice or soft drink bottles would create so much disruption and inconvenience that the ban simply wouldn't work, unless there were an alternative.
There are biodegradable materials, but they need further development for particular purposes. If we look at what engineers have achieved until now in human history, this does not seem a too difficult engineering problem to solve.
And how far away from that are we?
Agreeing about it seems to me to be a long way away. Once we agree to take effort, things happen.
This is known as the circular economy, the idea that what happens at the end of a product's life is factored in at the design stage. But with 1 million plastic bottles bought every minute, if agreement to develop alternatives is a long way off, then we need some way to deal with the bottles we're producing now.
Waste collection and recycling play a crucial role at current stage, making sure that plastic bottles, once discarded, do end up in solid waste management system rather than in the fields and then after that in rivers or in oceans. It is essential.
And here the situation varies dramatically around the world. In the developed world, most waste is collected, but recycling varies. In Germany, about 80% of plastic waste is recycled. The United States does worse. When it comes to plastic bottles, it only recycles around 30%. But the biggest contributors to plastic in the oceans are developing countries, places like China, Indonesia and the Philippines, where waste is often not collected properly, let alone recycled.
In low-income countries, they are struggling to provide any level of public services or public utilities to their citizens. And then one can imagine that it's much more difficult simply due to lack of financial resources to organize such services for all their citizens.
In these countries, recycling is often done by so-called waste pickers.
All recycling in low-income countries and lower middle-income countries is purely due to free market. People will engage in collection of waste for recycling, in this case plastic waste for recycling, only if it is profitable for them.
Is it time to ban the plastic bottle? In this inquiry, our expert witnesses have told us about the enormous amount of plastic waste we generate and how a ban on water bottles might be one way to reduce it. But, as we've heard, a total ban on plastic bottles just isn't feasible without a viable alternative. Improving waste collection and recycling will help in the short term, but ultimately, Captain Charles Moore suggests that stopping the oceans filling with plastic might require an even bigger change.
If that defines our age, the plastic god, then we've got to fear and respect the plastic god. We have to have this zero waste concept where everything is a resource waiting to be recovered, and we treat things with respect and put them where they belong. A place for everything and everything in its place.
That's all for this edition of The Inquiry, and from me, James Fletcher. The programme was produced by Simon Mabin and Sarah Shebier. It was mixed by David Crackles and edited by Emma Rippon. We always love to hear what you think of the programme, so please review us wherever you get your podcast or get in touch via our Twitter account, which is @BBC The Inquiry. And we've got a little podcast recommendation of our own for you. It's a special series from the Documentary Podcast, in which people from across the United States are telling their stories about life in President Donald Trump's America. They've been using their smartphones to record their thoughts and experiences. It's called The Response, America's Story, and those episodes have been appearing all this week. You can search for the documentary on your podcast app or go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts. And next week on The Inquiry, we'll be asking, what would a war with North Korea look like?